Hi everyone, welcome to today's session on will the subscription metrics you use break or make your business? This roundtable is brought to you by Renewed, the open network for specialized subscription, membership and event professionals. My name is Sue Stevens and I'm the Executive Director for Renewed Europe, and I'll be moderating today's event. This session is the first in a new series Renewed has created all around the topic of driving value. So throughout this series, we'll be diving into areas of best practice to add enterprise value, regardless of an exit or acquisition timeline. If you have questions for today's speakers, you can submit them throughout the presentation and at the end during the Q&A session by using the chat function. After the presentation, you'll have access to the recording and slides and various bits of collateral, and we'll send you an email with the link once that's available online. Housekeeping, please keep yourself on mute to minimize background noise. Do turn on your videos if you can. It makes a big difference to see everyone's faces. And please put your name and company in your box so we know who's asking questions. On today's session, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers, Andy Burden, who is the co-founder of Subscribe, and Peter Dodds, who is the commercial director of FT Specialist at the Financial Times. So we're going to start, and I'm going to hand over to Andy.
Thanks, Sue, and hi, everyone. So my background and specialism is B2B information and premium subscriptions and memberships. Subscribe have been around now for 6 years and helped various brands, including Pete's over at FT Specialist. What I'm hoping to show you today is a way of rethinking your performance for premium subscriptions. And the reason I'm really passionate about doing that is because every gig I've had within a subscription team has involved trying to align people and work through what performance looks like rather than kind of iterate on results. So it's kind of like a life's passion, if you like. So let me get into sharing this with you. The size of the prize. In other words, why should you bother spending an hour on quite a nice day listening to this stuff? Much of it which will be metrics. And it's because, put simply, making small improvements in growth from your existing customer base can generate millions of dollars or pounds over a 5-year cycle. And if you want to sit down with me to quickly work through what exactly that means for the size of your business and what the dials are, then please just get in touch. What I've promised you today, and the thing that's kept me as my control document for today's session, is that I want to show how to create a performance mindset, to be in control of the narrative at board level through to cross-functional leads and into your teams, and alignment with commercial teams and others, to be able to assess the impact of your product. Obviously and naturally linking up with this topic, it's to optimize value, reduce leakage, and even I might lure you into sticking around with the promise of faster, stickier conversions for your new business. So hold me to that. Why should you trust me? Okay, I've been around for 20 years, but it doesn't mean I know what I'm doing, right? But I've got a really great expert network around me. And it's wider and broader than these logos, but I've been testing out and researching this performance framework for at least 2 years now and stress testing it. So the agenda today is I want to give you a perspective from your peer, so that, and that's Pete, so that you get a view from the front line about using different metrics. I'm going to share a rapid tour of perspectives from experts I've met whilst going through this research, and also some kind of source material. Obviously, I'll go into the framework itself and share some metrics with you. I've promised a case study with real life data, and so I've got a couple there for you. And I'm hoping that we have time for questions and answers at the end. I think we will. So over to your peer, Pete Dodds. He's the commercial director of the FT Specialist at the Financial Times. More than 20 years experience in B2B subscriptions. And Pete has been coming to the Subscribe meetups for subscription leaders for probably a couple of years or more now, and has been really supportive of Subscribe's mission to unlock enterprise value. Over to Pete.
Thanks, Andy. And I like the fact that you stress that it's more than 20 years, as opposed to your 20 years. I'm obviously older than you. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I've worked in sort of commercial side of subscriptions, but I also have a background in product development and editorial. So I've kind of worked on different sides of the sort of subscription business. Andy is actually going to do most of the heavy lifting today. I'm just his warm-up act, but I have been working with Subscribe this year, and we've really done a sort of really deep dive in some of our subscription data, looking at sort of different metrics that might help us sort of better understand our subs business, and really ultimately it's the goal of driving that sort of longer term growth. I wanted to start though just by sort of framing the challenge that's likely familiar to most B2B publishers. You have a good product, good market fit, you're solving problems for customers, your sales are strong, all of these things are positive, but then certain things start to change, and while your typical metrics, your renewal rates, your new sales, your conversion rates, whatever you're measuring, they're typically fine, but you're no longer seeing the same year-on-year performance. Your growth is slowing, and the challenge can be summed up, I think, in this quote that Andy got from one of the publishers that he works with, that the sales numbers aren't down, we're just not growing. And I'm hoping to God that other people recognise that, and it's not just my problem. Otherwise, this can be an awkward session. Andy's labelled the next slide sort of Dodd's law, which is very generous of him, but I'm sure it's a phenomenon you're all familiar with. But I put this in really as a reminder of the challenge we all face at some point, particularly with maturing products. The numbers are arbitrary. You could add a 0 to each of those if you like, and it will still the logic really still holds. But essentially, what we're saying is you can maintain a stable and healthy sort of 90% gross renewal rate, stable new business sales, but the sort of performance that drove 10% year-on-year growth when you're at a small product and a new product is actually going to be stagnating or going backwards as it matures, unless you really significantly increase new business sales or new sales. So in this example, that sort of 10% growth rate, you're going to need to treble your new business sales if you're going to maintain that sort of growth rate. And again, unless I'm in an exceptionally unusual business, that sort of level of growth is something that your FD is going to be incredibly interested in when you're speaking to him or her. So that sort of growth piece is really important. The reason I highlight this is because actually this was one of the challenges that we brought Andy in to talk about within FD Specialist, and looking at how do we address the challenge of a maturing business. But it's actually an idea that we also want to look at with our less mature products. The aim is really to get ahead of this challenge and understanding how we drive long-term value with our less mature products. And the work we've been doing with Andy, I suppose it's highlighted sort of two really sort of key things for me. I think one, just the vital importance of expansion revenues. Strong renewals are not enough on their own. They're essential, but they're not enough on their own. You really need the ability to drive price rises and other expansion revenues, and particularly when you've got mature or maturing products, as you can see here. You're going to need to get more from your existing subscriber base if you're going to continue to grow. And I think the second point relating to that is, as you start to focus on, as we started to focus on expansion revenues, is we needed to understand a lot more about what was happening with our subscription file, and a lot more than we were getting from our traditional metrics, that we just weren't getting the insights, I think, into what was going on from those. So, we all recognise some of the warning signs that things start to drop off. New sales taking a little bit longer to sign off. Renewals, price rises might be a little bit harder to secure. You're hearing from the sales team things are just getting a little bit tougher. Renewal rates might be dropping off 1 or 2%. But those typical high-level metrics aren't really sort of telling you what's going on. Now, of course, we all hopefully know our businesses and know our industries really pretty well. So, we'll always have a hunch about what the challenge is. It could be client consolidation. There's more competition in the market. There's questions about the client value that they're getting from your product. You might have some internal issues like sort of sales and marketing. There might be some internal issues. So you'll have some hunches about what's going on. But I think, alongside those sort of market dynamics and the insights, I didn't really feel that the traditional metrics we were looking at were really telling me enough. If I was going to come up with very specific solutions to problems, I better understand what the problems were, and not just be basing that on sort of hunches and ideas of, look, I think this is kind of what's going on with my product. So if the goal is to create a sort of product with really those sort of very healthy expansion revenues, I need to make sure I'm focusing on the right opportunities, the right risks. And when we looked at this, obviously this isn't news to you. Not all of our clients are equal. We obviously don't tell them that, but they're not. Some have the potential to really expand revenues over time, others less so. Not all elements of our product are equal. Some parts of our products will actually drive more value than other parts. So we worked with Andy to look at our subscription file, going back. I think initially I gave Andy something like 15 years worth of data to work with, sort of colossal data dump that I sort of sent over to him. But I think Andy often sort of recommends we take a sort of 5-year view of this because it makes it a bit more usable. But this was probably one of the aha moments for me working with Andy and looking at sort of different types of metrics was the sort of multi-year or looking at your subscription file and how it changes and tracking the revenues over multiple years. We were segmenting our data by client tiers. We were segmenting it by product tiers with Andy. This isn't necessarily uncommon, but when we kind of munged all that data together and we looked at it and said, well, what are the patterns and how is revenue changing from different client tiers or product types over a 5-year period, you're actually able to identify certain patterns and trends that really aren't apparent if you're looking at a 1-year view or a year-on-year model, which is actually quite traditionally what we might look at in sales, is what's happening year on year. When you start looking at the same data but cut in different ways over a 5-year period, it really started to sort of highlight certain patterns and trends that we hadn't really been aware of. So we could see more clearly which clients or types of clients were driving longer term value. Where the expansion revenues were strong, where they weren't. Were there other clients that fitted those characteristics which weren't seeing the same trends and patterns over a period of time? So, what's going on? There could be a certain group of clients that should be following that growth pattern, but their revenues might be declining. What's going on there? That gives us something to really explore. We could also see where clients were maybe dragging down renewal rates, or their spend was reducing over time, and also look at products, how the products were performing and elements of the products, because the usefulness of a product also changes over time, and also can change depending on what competitors are doing. So again, just that kind of product and tier based analysis, but through the lens of a 5-year plus period, really sort of helped identify sort of patterns that we could look at. The work we're doing with Andy, I suppose the main thing really is it's kind of enabling us to be a lot more forensic, with sort of more of a data-backed analysis of what we're looking at, helping to sort of focus on looking at sort of the risks, the opportunities, but backed not just by our insights, our knowledge of our market, which are essential part of it, but also looking at using our subscriptions data as a tool and looking at using that to understand, well, actually, there are certain patterns, there are certain trends, there is something going on here, and it's given us a guide to be able to sort of explore those areas, and look for solutions. And I think as a final thought for me, this isn't all exactly new, and some of you are probably sitting there going, "Well, yeah, okay, client tiers, we do that. I would hope you do. Yeah, we got a list of customer targets. Yeah, it would be worrying if people didn't have that. And also, long-term product planning, strategic reviews. Help heaven help us if we're not doing that sort of thing. These are all things that we do. So the sort of metrics we've been looking at with Andy, and looking at these sort of new metrics like net revenue retention, and looking at this sort of time-based thing, it really is just an additional data point. It's something else that supports our analysis. So we're not just basing it on hunches and some top level metrics we've traditionally used. It's just giving us a little bit of a lens into the workings of our subscription file, where those patterns and anomalies might be. So it's proved useful sort of additional tool to stuff that we would be doing anyway.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, look, what I'd say is that you've been really open to exploring ways of unlocking performance, and it's been really useful to test things out with you as well. Look, I think as I go through the framework and then go into the case studies, there may be some additional kind of color that you can add to that. I'm not going through your data in this session, but I think some of the stuff will resonate. Look, I'll go into sharing some perspectives that I picked up either by having conversations with people or looking at source material. I'm hoping that just a quick blast through some of those opinions will be a useful bit of background context for you, and then I promise I'll get into the framework. First off, I didn't speak with Bill Gates, but I thought this stood out. Success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose. And what Pete's outlined there is a couple of things. One is don't wait for the problems to set in, because actually one of the things that we'll be discussing later is then the need to reorganize your teams and your structures. That all takes time. So go in thinking, even though stuff may be going gangbusters today, it's worthwhile thinking through what might happen tomorrow. From a private equity perspective, we put the effort into collect consistent, correct data about our customers, and it had much greater value than the fancy AI stuff. Now that's from the INSEAD leveraging digital data and AI technologies to increase enterprise value. Of course, AI will help, but actually the machines need organized data in order to create good outputs. From someone, a very successful person within the Subscribe Expert Network who's gone through a big transaction, private equity firms will often look at the quality of management information as a proxy for how good the company is. So when you're being asked questions about bright spots in your installed base, and you're able to answer those questions very quickly, it's a good sign that you're in control of the kind of information you should be in control of anyway, regardless of the transaction. I've got to admit, I thought maybe AI could be the answer to this. I've got a framework. How can the machines just press fast forward for me? So I spoke with the chief data scientist who explained, sadly, machines are great with lots of data, but with B2B information brands, you have hundreds, not hundreds of thousands of customers, and the human brain is still better at spotting patterns. So that made me slightly deflated for a moment. Then I realized that the framework is a better way of spotting patterns. So that's what I want to share with you. From a strategic perspective, the Subscribe advisor, Tony Jaros, ex-Sirius Decisions and Forrester, really nailed it home for me. Subscription teams must collaborate to protect and grow the installed base. That's been my controlling statement for the work that I've been doing. From a change management perspective, which is what we're talking about, sometimes change doesn't require more horsepower. Sometimes we just need to unlock the parking brake. So you're probably sitting on a bunch of stuff that you can release the parking brake. But sadly, you will have resistance to change. And this is an oldie but goldie. It is difficult to get someone to understand something when they believe their salary depends on not understanding it. So lifting the parking brake. This isn't a question that needs an answer, but I think it's good to mull over. Do your cross-functional teams willingly accept that they are measured and compensated for their part in protecting and growing your installed base of customers? And that's a fundamental question. And I meet a lot of very experienced subscription leaders from cross-functional teams. And the answer is no. And in order to really unlock performance in subscription businesses, the answer has to be yes. Now, how do you go through this? This is where it starts getting financy. I may lose the room. I'm not a finance person. I hate looking at spreadsheets for finance. What I've been trying to do here is to create almost like a sports performance framework, or a simpler way of looking at this stuff from a non-financial point of view. So what you should be able to do is clear this slide with your teams across all functions and understand where they sit in relation to the annual recurring revenue waterfall. And they should understand why it's important that they get on and do the job of improving each part of these elements, or sorry, each relevant part of these elements. So I'm going to clear the slide for you. It's on the left-hand side for the majority of the chart, it's about your existing customers. Gross revenue retention, GRR, is the impact that cancellations and other forms of contraction revenue, like downgrades and price decreases, have on your opening ARR. Fortunately, you're also able to then compensate for that loss by adding expansion revenues, and that's upsell and cross-sell, as long as it's recurring revenue products, and also price increases. So when you look across the line from your opening ARR, you hope that your company is in growth because it's reaching 100% plus of your opening ARR. If it's not, it sounds harsh, but it's in decline. Understanding that and then having teams that align to that is incredibly important. You're also in a position where you can sell to new customers. So you get your new annual recurring revenue, and that informs your closing ARR and therefore your opening ARR for the next period. I think certainly the companies that I've worked in and where I'm speaking with people, the emphasis has been traditionally on new customers, and there's been a bit of a bun fight over the expansion revenues as well, and it's led to a bit of mess. But getting clarity on this and then building up subscription acumen across the waterfall is the way to start unlocking performance. Let me unpack the gross revenue and net revenue retention a bit further and hopefully try to simplify it. So looking at both GRR and NRR measures how effectively you are protecting and growing your installed base. So see the gross revenue retention as your protect play. And it's a bit like fuel in a car. You cannot get more than 100%. And the fuel moves closer to empty because of contraction in revenues. On the grow side of things, net revenue retention, it's a bit like putting your foot down on the gas. It's the extra revenue or the extra speed you get from upgrades and price increases. But it's really risky to take your eyes off the fuel gauge. And I'll share a case study in a moment that will explain that. So let's get into the framework. So this is about protecting and growing the installed base. And so I've created, of course I have, I'm a consultant, a 2x2 box. And along one line, it's about protecting the installed base, and on the other, it's about growing it. What I've found actually through a couple of years of testing stuff out is that you can look at this from a revenue point of view, which is what I've done with Pete, but you can also introduce customer sentiment into this box. Today's session is all about revenue, but the customer sentiment side of things is your ability to be able to look around the corner and see what's lurking there. That might be growth, it might be a competitor, it might be a change in the sentiment about your product. But by looking at sentiment as well as revenue, you get a really complete picture. On one side, you've got a vulnerable subscription base if you're on the left, because you're unable to protect and you're unable to grow. And then on the right hand side, it's resilient because you've got a sticky base and you're able to grow. So the goal when you know you're going gangbusters is to be in the top right. If you drift down to the bottom left, then particularly with annual subscriptions that are big enough purchases from your customers, it's probably an 18-month turnaround to get out of that. So you need to avoid drifting into the bottom left. Because this is a revenue session, I've labeled the axes gross revenue retention and net revenue retention. So let me take you through an example here, hopefully to bring this to life. So when you're shifting to premium pricing, I hope that you're doing that when you've built up enough network effects or enough of a sticky base in the bottom right to think, aha, okay, that age-old question, are we leaving money on the table? Well, yeah, let's go for it. So let's press the pricing lever. You get into the top left, but you only do that if you can be thinking a couple of moves ahead with your product team and other teams to make sure that by putting the price up, you're able to create a decent enough product and a decent enough experience to know that instead of dropping to the bottom left, you're able to shift across to the right-hand side. And once you've shifted across to the right-hand side, because people are getting a reasonable experience from your product and experience, you evidence the value and you get forensic with your ideal customer persona, and you start looking at why they're growing, how they're growing, the results that they're getting from you, so that you can model that into your new business team to acquire similar ICPs, or you can look at your your install base and increase your in-account expansion by looking at that and going, okay, we need to introduce more products and more experiences to the install base. So you go from the bottom right to the top left and hopefully into the top right. I promised benchmarks as well, and the benchmarks that I use for established subscriptions. So this is different to if you're going hell for leather with a brand new subscription brand, and I recognize that. But with an established premium subscription base, the crosshairs that I use for gross revenue retention is 90%, and the crosshairs for net revenue retention is 100%. So this is strong, resilient, this is vulnerable. Vulnerable, you can go through a strategy to go into being vulnerable by putting the price up, as long as your strategy is to pull you away and back into the resilient side. Sorry, I will go back. There's one other benchmark that I wanted to share with you, which I find interesting, is across now 18 premium subscription brands, the median is this X. X marks the spot. And it's actually surprising to see that subscription brands are in the top left for more than a cycle. That would usually indicate that they're able to put the price up, so very good with that expansion revenue, but they're sacrificing gross revenue retention. Part of that might be the trap of using net revenue retention as almost like the one-dimension metric. In terms of diagnostics, I'm going to just give you a quick view of a couple of tools that I use. So one is about protecting or leveraging the base. And I think by tracking the gross revenue retention by segment, you're able to start really exploring where you've got, in some instances, 100% gross revenue retention for a segment over a period of time. That's incredibly good product market fit. Hit the pricing lever, or get more of those to build the network effects before you do. For your premium accounts, I think you should be modeling a high gross revenue retention, because the job is to defend those, to build fortifications around it. But you may accept a lower gross revenue retention rate in your riskier segments, because you're accepting that some of them will go by the wayside and you'll be able to increase revenues from them. The importance is not to just treat this as one blob of data, but to get into the segmentation. And then if you're leaving money on the table, you can start to model this in. So the gap between your gross revenue retention and net revenue retention is a really good way of measuring this. By that, I mean that if you've got 80% gross revenue retention and 100% net revenue retention, there's a 20% gap. Track that gap by segment, track it over time, and you'll be able to see if you're introducing volatility into your base or if you're actually leaving money on the table. And there's a good happy medium between the two for your premium accounts. So I know that that's a lot of going through numbers and frameworks and stuff. What I want to do is share a couple of bits of data from real life projects, which will bring this to life, I hope. So I think we've got enough time to ask questions on this as well. These old metrics, the first case study is a brand that had been using annual recurring revenue and new business. It was reasonable enough. Looking at that chart and that chart alone, which is your annual recurring revenue, where would you say the problem sets in? We can get some numbers in chats if you like. (2021). Not sure I see a problem. Fair enough. I think if your 2022 is higher than your 2023 and it's closed, it's a tricky one to support. And sorry, then yes, 2021. Okay. Let me just show you the performance framework. So looking at it from a point of view of gross and net revenue retention, in 2019, I'm seeing an optimized subscription brand. In 2020, there's a huge fall. There's a huge decline. So I would want to be asking questions, well, ideally in 2019, but certainly by 2020. And I think this is the trap of year on year and also traditional metrics. Actually, by 2022, something is going right and going in the right direction, but potentially because the metrics aren't allowing for that forensic focus, it's flick-flacking around the performance grid here. And it's a tricky trap to get out of. When I look at other fundamentals within the same case, I look at the gross revenue retention, which I mentioned before, over time, over those 5 years to give a direction of travel. And what strikes me is that the tier 1 clients are not above 90%. I think they should be, at least for some of the time. Tier 2, I could argue that roughly speaking, it looks okay, but I'd like to dig into some of the peaks and troughs. Tier 3, I buy that as being a risky segment, and therefore you're accepting quite a low gross revenue retention rate, provided that you're getting additional revenue from the ones that stick around. Now let me show you the growing the base side of things. So what this shows, and remember that gap that I told you about, the example was 80 and 100% gives you a 20% gap. Every segment is below 10% here, every segment. And also, if you squint your eyes, it's all trending in the same way. So that tells me that there's a one-size-fits-all commercial approach. Tier 3 should be well above 10% in order to sustain that lower gross revenue retention. So I can see some fundamental problems here that the traditional metrics won't show up. And suddenly the questions are being asked in 2023 when the ARR stops following the linear trend. But you can get a head start on this by at least a couple of years if you choose to look. Another case study, second case study. This is a company, second cycle private equity, between 10 and 15 million, and very experienced operators within it, very experienced. Tons of data analysts, tons of data, too much. And I've decided to just pick out one thing here. Which sales team makes the President's Club if you're just looking at net revenue retention? Is it the team 1 in the light blue, where you're going 120%, 120%, and then 130%? Or is it team 2, where in year 1 you're level pegging 120%, drops down to 105%, comes back up to about 115%? Which team makes the President's Clubs? for those 3 years. You could argue they split the prize in year one. I think year two and year three, you're throwing all the pizzas and good times at team one. When we look at the data, and I've simplified this, team one has moved from, and across 5 years, team one has moved from this position up, which is good. I think they've got a bit too handy with the pulling the price lever, and it's become indiscriminate, and they're driving the business into the ground. This is a tailspin. This is an 18-month turnaround. Turnarounds are not only bad for business, they leak talent. No one wants to be there. And then team two, although the NRR showed a poor performance, they are improving. If you look at this trend line, they are improving the stickiness of their solution. And although the net revenue retentions are dropping, actually people are sticking around. And when I looked into the behaviors behind that, it was because team two were slightly more mature, so they've been in market longer. They were very, very good at going mid-cycle and justifying and creating statements of value to get their customers to buy additional product. Team one were not. They were doing the urgent cash cow visit and applying huge price increases because they were trying to hit their commission base. And they were even applying that to non-core segment. So essentially sacrificing the business side of it in order to hit their commissions. So I'm going to try and summarize some stuff I think you should take away from this. One is, no one uses the same standards to measure this stuff. There are standards available to measure net revenue and gross revenue retention available from SaaS metrics. It's been devised by CFOs who are tied into SaaS and private equity, but I've used that as the base because else we're just struggling to define what we mean by these measures. So use standards, and then that way, when you go through a transaction, you're not having to explain the way you measure it, and you're immediately on a back foot. You can use some standards out there. Please get in touch if you want to see those. I think secondly, if you're trapped into a year-on-year view, which many people are, you're going to end up iterating on what's gone before. Whereas if you can look at your revenue or purchase order history over years, you can begin to see clear trend lines across your products, your customer segments, and even your commercial teams to spot where there are risks and opportunities. So that's the point around segmentation as well. I think it's incredibly important to then use that to discover where you've got customer value and where you're leaking. So one thing that I haven't taken you through today, because it's just going down another rabbit hole, is that you can use this data to go, okay, where are we increasing our revenues? And are we doing it because we're throwing more and more product into the mix and therefore we're not getting the right kind of list price? Because that can be value leakage that looks positive as well. So it's really important to start looking at your internal measures, but actually also speaking to customers. So that's something I do all the time. I speak to my clients' customers about what performance looks like and what needs to change and how things are going well, so you can start modeling for product improvement, but also amplifying the bright spots in your installed base, because then your teams can start looking for similar clients who could grow with you. I've already mentioned the ARR waterfall. I think it's incredibly important to empower teams, but it's not happening just across the board. And this is a bit of a plug for my own measure, but the must-have score is something I developed with a working group a few years ago. It's something that I track for my clients, and it's not the score itself, but the answers to the question: how would renewed improve from a 7 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10? People give you product and experience improvement ideas, which you can categorize and look at by accounts, by personas, so you can model in stuff that your customer base needs in order to stick around and grow with you. the must-have score is closely aligned to the way that corporate purchasers spend. No one wants to turn off something that the rest of the company perceive to be useful. So 50% of the buying criteria is based around perceived use of value or must-have score. Get that right, and that is, I believe, the North Star metric for subscription success. The acid test, another heavy question, I'm afraid, but do you think you have rewarded teams or been rewarded yourself for hitting a number regardless of benefit for the health or potential growth of your business? I'll admit, I think I have in the past. And don't worry, we're not doing a show and tell, but I think that's the acid test for how effective an organization is at supporting subscription growth. And I think change has to come from the top, with teams self-organizing around this and understanding performance, not results. So what I do at Subscribe, I look for outcomes for my clients in terms of revenue growth, revenue retention, and must-have score, and improving that. And that looks like diagnostics and testing and trackers, but all of it is powered by the subscription leaders in my network. I'm constantly testing things out there. So I think that we've created enough time for questions, or we can bring Pete back on to add some colour to the conversation. So are there any questions before we start chatting amongst ourselves, Pete?
I think everyone's mulling over the information you've given them. They're all pondering.
David, what are your customers doing about the maintenance accounts, Andy? In our case, the bottom 25% of our customers generate 1.9% of our total turnover. They renew well, but it's rare they move up into the premium category. Yeah, rule of thumb for me is those maintenance accounts, it's not about how much they're spending, it's about their future wallet, I suppose. And where I've gone into situations like that before, I've looked at almost like a rule of threes. A third of them are probably going to stick around in that maintenance territory. A third of them, they might make the move, and a third just won't. And by making the move, I mean that by going into them and understanding what they need to perform better and clicking the product around that, potentially it's a positioning issue. You can go through that strategic move of going from, because it sounds like you're bottom right with your maintenance accounts there. You look at that and go, how do we get from bottom right to the top left, where we lose some, but at a board level, as an SLT, as cross-functional leads, we understand that we're going to lose some, but the benefits of losing them are outweighing them just sticking around. And then you get across to the right, but you've got to think three steps ahead there. Product has to be thinking about the right kind of product to offer in return for that increased price. And quite often companies won't invest in true customer success until it's too late. You've got to be thinking about that before you start making those kind of dramatic moves. Otherwise, you've got essentially a glorified customer service team that won't cut the mustard. So I think it's about just going, okay, let's do this. Let's go into a vulnerable state in order to get into a more resilient zone on the performance framework.
Thanks.
Something that Pete and I have been talking about is, once you go through this, once you've gone through the the forensic examination of the data, that's not the end of it. I mean, it goes back to that point around change management and resistance to change, Pete. So, that might be it depends how much you want to share, but that might be a useful conversation to have people listen in on. And I'll keep an eye on chat whilst we're chatting. So what's your view on what you do next?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. we live in a world where there's ever increasing amounts of data at our fingertips, and this was yet more data that we had to look at. But I think what I came to realize is, will we set up and organized and resourced in a way to start thinking about this in a different way? We're used to just sort of looking at our traditional sort of sales metrics, and as long as the teams are hitting their renewal targets and they're hitting their new business targets. But it takes time for someone in my position to look at this, but it also takes the head of sales time to think differently about, okay, what does this mean for how we run the team? What does it mean for the clients we're going to go after, or whatever? So, and I think that was a bit of that has probably made us stop and think about, okay, how do we actually implement some actions off this? Because one of my bugbears is always, whether it's this sort of data or any sort of data, just data for the sake of, oh, that's interesting. You actually don't see the benefit until you do something with it. And I think I probably hadn't realized actually what was required to turn this into actions off the back of it. And I think that's something that you're alluding to, the stuff around sort of customer success. I mean, that's one part of the puzzle, but it goes through your entire sales operation and beyond, into your product team and your content development, your content developers as well. So I think I'd underestimated the what you need to do to then drive actions.
Mm. Ben Oakshott has asked, where would you prioritize sales, marketing, customer success resource, top right or bottom left? It depends. So if I go through that or think back to that second case study with the high NRR, absolutely the customer success side of things would be prioritized to the top right. So for those customers that were sticking around and trying to migrate as many as possible into the top right, that is a customer success play to me. I think, and having led customer success teams, quite often it's seen as where everything's going wrong, let's send customer success in. That's a really tricky ground to burn your finite resources on. I would much rather get really deep into the customers that are growing and then model for more of those, either within the install base or through pursuit lists from new business. I mean, the dream sequence for me would be to go, okay, I can identify a set of customers that, much as I dislike NPS, are giving a 9 or 10 NPS, 9 or 10 must-have score. And I'm therefore know that they're going to not only be willing to tell people about us, but also when they're asked, do you find this stuff useful? They'll say, yeah, this is how we find it useful. That drives second order revenues. Second order revenues are stickier and faster conversions, which I promised to tell you all about. So those second order revenues come from people being referrals in late stage pipeline conversations to get ICPs over the line. But they're also fantastic at helping you to grow within your install base of people who aren't yet buying the full kit from you. Marketing, I see as more of I think you can make an argument that marketing can divide into the different zones. Actually, I think marketing should, and actually product's not in that question. But for me, product can end up getting trapped into creating very bright, shiny stuff. And the justification for doing that is because you can put a figure into an Excel sheet and show the financial director that it's worth doing. But actually that means that the maintenance of the existing product is often left to one side. So going back to that ARR waterfall, I would want to see a product team that's looking at the contraction side of things as well as the expansion side of things, and taking different disciplines and working with different teams to make sure that those metrics are being driven in the right way. I hope that answers your question, Ben, but if you want to go off mute and just ask any other follow-on questions from that, if you're still around. I think actually, Pete, I got a question about the Dodds Law slide, which I like. That sounds good. Dodds Law. And it's from Rupert Collins-White at Burlington Media. So what about where you're working in markets where there aren't the numbers for this takeoff into sustained growth? So where there are ceilings?
So so I just clarify that.
Well, I suppose we might need Rupert to clarify it, but I suppose what you're outlining there is you've got this machine that's growing, and the problem with growth is that it becomes harder to feed the beast. You didn't say that, but that's the dramatic way of saying it. But actually, if you've got a very finite set of accounts that you can sell to, how does that play into Dodds Law? And I'm looking at it thinking, well, there'll be less aggressive need for growth, but growth will still need to happen. But
I mean, you might be in a sort of fairly small market that attracts less competition. I mean, that is quite often the case, not always, but you could be, well, it's not a huge addressable market. We found a nice little niche in there. We're doing a really good job, but because it's not a big market, you're not attracting more people in, which generally suggests you'd have a higher renewal rate because there's less alternatives, but you are still going to need to find ways of making more money from that group. And I'm sure we've all experienced this at some point. There is only so far you can keep pushing price rises before questions are asked about value. So if you've got that smaller group, then you've probably got to be thinking harder about actually how are we going to be developing value and developing our product to establish that growth, because you can't just go out and say, well, we'll go to another 2,000 clients if they're not there.
Yeah, good point. So that traditional thing of looking at new business first doesn't apply if you've got a very limited market. So therefore, you've got to be more forensic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Rupert, I hope that answered that question. Here we go. What I mean is that if true growth is predicated on tripling in an ongoing way in niche B2B markets, that unbounded market doesn't exist. There will be a TAM, total addressable market, that will run out much faster than a B2C. Anyone could be a customer business. The Dodds Law side of things is for B2B limit. I mean, it's still a limited market.
It's still limited, but I think what I said still stands, that if you know your new business can't keep growing at that level, you better be focusing on expansion revenues, because that's literally the only way that you're going to continue to grow. Even with 100% renewal rate, there's a point where you're going to stop growing because people won't accept a price rise.
I suppose you could use it as a protective play and get 100% gross revenue retention, or as close to as possible, and then try and tap into new product sets to build on top of that.
Yeah. And that's what, when I say that sort of expansion revenues, it's kind of, it's not just price rises, it's kind of what new products can we produce.
Yeah, good. We are running short on time. I will say, as I mentioned before, that customer sentiment can be slotted into the performance framework as well. And so a similar invite, if someone wants to dig into that a bit deeper for their business, just let me know. And then look, also similarly, I'm in a beautiful place down in Cornwall. And so if you want to draw a performance framework out on the beach and use pebbles for data and have a coffee, then please do think about coming down. It's about an hour away from London. I've had a couple of meetings like that, and it's a quite nice way of thinking about business and life.
That looks great.
Well, thanks very much, Andy and Peter. That's fab. So I think if there's no more questions, I think we're happy to end it there, but thank you for your time. That's been really interesting and useful.
I'll send some collateral after this to you, Sue.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you. And we'll include that with the email that we send out to everyone.
Great. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time, everyone. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Andy.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.